This on screen is a genuine quote I read, and I looked into it, and apparently Ernest Hemingway absolutely said this. And the second I read this quote, I had to stick it in my presentations because it's very true in most cases. When I wrote my very first application for an open day in first year, I thought it was great. I thought I covered all the boundaries. I thought I'd been personal with it. And I sent it to a friend of mine who was a trainee in the city. And he called me up. He was like, mate, this is so bad that you need to drive down to London and we'll spend the weekend working on it together and I'll kind of show you what you need to do. I thought he was joking. Turns out he wasn't joking. And we actually spent probably 8 hours going over everything line by line. And sometimes that's the way it's got to be with your first application. It doesn't matter if the first one is bad, as long as you recognize that, you get lots of help proofreading and perspectives from other people. It doesn't need to be lawyers. It can be anyone that comes in with a fresh perspective. And eventually you can then build up an application that really sells you. So on that note, here are some points that cover a lot of the questions that I tend to get asked. So everybody has been told loads of times, avoid generic answers, but no one really gives practical tips on what that can mean. Throughout this presentation, hopefully you'll get a much better idea of that. But as a quick pointer, one of the things you can do is just match the terminology you use to the terminology of the firm. If a firm says we're looking for organizational skills, use the word organizational rather than time management. If a firm says which practice areas are you interested in, if the firm's practice area is called banking, use the word banking rather than finance or capital markets or something else like that. So that can be quite a good starting point because it makes it easier for a grad recruiter to just tick off the fact that you've got what they were looking for. Also remember that firm websites are written by grad recruiters. So if you're just copying and pasting bits from those websites, they will probably recognize that. And we'll get into that a bit more later. Next question I get asked a lot is how many applications should I submit? Now, on the previous slide, I mentioned that my first application probably took me 8 hours. It doesn't mean every application will take you 8 hours. Once you've got to grips with kind of how to structure them, how to approach them, how to talk about your experiences and draw loads of skills out of them, that skill will help you improve and speed up the process of writing future applications. So my first one took me 8 hours. My second one might have taken me 6 hours. By the time I'd worked on 10 or 12, sometimes I could write an application in an hour and a half, 2 hours, because I already had lots of great content I could use from previous drafts. I was well versed in how to research firms and how to kind of differentiate them and articulate the different things that make firms stand out. And we'll talk about that a bit later. So to answer that question, it's if you can put in the time, it'd be great if you could send out 10 or 15 applications and just trust that the first 5 or 6 will probably take you a lot longer than the next 10. It's worth hedging your bets, and I'll talk a lot more about rejection later, but sometimes a rejection might just be pot luck. I have one friend who applied to one firm, got an interview, got a training contract, and then qualified as an associate. All of us still hate him for that, and that is not normal. So just trust that it's worth hedging your bets. The next point is about kind of accuracy, and everyone always talks about spelling, grammar, punctuation, and we all know that that stuff needs to be great. But what people don't mention as much is its structure. And structure is absolutely key, because if the structure is all over the place, it doesn't matter how beautifully written the sentences are, it will be very difficult for a grad recruiter to kind of unpick everything you've done and understand the value that you could add to the firm. So absolutely important that you stick to a decent structure. And a good way of doing that is to start with headings. Even if it's a 250-word answer, stick 3 or 4 headings down before you start writing and keep referencing those headings to make sure that you stick to them. You can delete the headings before you send it off, but just make sure that structure makes sense. Same with a cover letter. Even if you've got the first paragraph being why commercial law and the second one being why that firm and the third paragraph being why you, make sure each of those sections is structured well rather than only thinking about the overall structure of the cover letter, and that should really help. Next bit of advice is write your applications in something like Microsoft Word. If you spend 8 hours working on an application and you write that application directly into some kind of online portal, and that portal crashes when you press submit, you've probably lost all your work. If you write in Word, firstly, you can build up a bank of answers that you can then reference for other applications later on. Secondly, you can keep an eye on word count, so you know if you're going too much off a tangent. And you can also benefit, at least to some extent, from spell check. But remember, spell check doesn't pick up absolutely everything. final point is there is a fine line between presenting yourself in the most positive way you can and lying. And if you lie, there's a very good chance you'll get caught out at some point. On my application forms, I had written that I spoke basic Mandarin and basic Hindi because I'd attended a couple of language lessons whilst on a government-funded study programs back in my university days. Now, at the time, I might have remembered a couple of words or a couple of greetings, but a year later, when it came to my interviews, and I realized I'd written that on my application form, I couldn't remember a word. So right before my interview, I was sitting there desperately trying to memorize basic greetings in those languages in case I was tested. And I've heard loads of stories of people saying they are fluent in a language, only to find that the interviewer is also fluent in their language. And partway through the interviewer just switches into that language midway through a sentence. So it's just not worth taking that kind of risk.